Mies van der Rohe is one of the most influential architects of the 20th century. His work can be found all over the world, with special concentrations in his original home country of Germany and his adopted hometown of Chicago, where the IIT campus alone has 20 of his buildings.
But I'm about 4 hours south of Chicago right now in Bloomington, Indiana, and I'm here to ask, is this a lost Mies van der Rohe building?
Well, the answer depends. And it depends on your idea of how author and attribution in architecture works. Do you think the work of the architect is done once the drawings are finished? Which drawings do we count, a full CD set or a napkin sketch? And is it even possible, or does it matter if we can attribute a design to a single person? The building in question was built from a design by Mies van der Rohe for the Pi Lamda Phi fraternity house at the University of Indiana at Bloomington.
And it shows up in the Pi Lamda Phi national publication. The boys in Bloomington are getting the country's most unusual fraternity house. All glass and steel. The future.
But the original project was scrapped when the fraternity was unable to raise enough funds to be able to build it.
In early 1953, the literature and the letters start to show some cracks.
And then it was largely forgotten, and even the Mies experts didn't know it existed.
Then in 2013, a gentleman named Sidney Eskenazi, who happened to be a fraternity member in 1951 and 52, he brings to the attention of our president at the time, his fraternity when he was a student here was designed by Mies van der Rohe.
Between then and today, Eskenazi became a very successful developer and philanthropist. He was looking for ways to contribute to his alma mater and supported the School of Architecture there with a donation for a building.
They needed a centralized office and administrative building. And he thought back to his fraternity's commission and thought the building's design, which was conceived around the principles of universal space, could be easily adapted to the cause. But the university had no interest in building a knockoff Mies that just used the design as inspiration while modernizing all the details and all the important parts. They wanted to build it in the most authentic way possible.
All we really knew were this set of 12 blueprints, 12 sheets of blueprints. And I wanted to know more.
That's when the Associate Vice President of Capital Planning, Adam Thies, went to work to find as much information about Mies's design as possible. He combed through the archives at the Art Institute of Chicago and at MoMA and found almost 300 documents, drawings, and correspondences between the fraternity and the architect.
In fact, we have the original timesheets showing how many hours Mies van der Rohe worked on it, how many hours his associate and his office worked on it. Between 1,200 and 1,400 hours were dedicated to it in 1952.
The original commission by Pi Lamda Phi yielded a design for a 10,000 square foot steel building with an open ground floor. The stair took you to the second level with 20 bedrooms lining the exterior glass wall, all connected with a corridor that wraps around an interior courtyard. The west side of the building was dedicated to a kitchen and a dining area and a lounge.
A lot of work and research went into constructing this according to the way that Mies originally intended that frat house to be built. Every effort was made to ensure that it was an authentic Mies van der Rohe building. No corners were cut, literally. Still, it's impossible to build a public building today in the same way that it would have been built in 1957. Standards of insulation, for instance, are much more regulated and restrictive. Fire codes and accessibility requirements just will not allow you to build in the same way, for good reason.
In 52, Mies and his team contemplated a limestone wall, but they felt that they could do it with a solid 6-inch limestone section. We now know today that probably would have left us with some serious challenges had that happened. What we now have done today is we still have the same limestone wall. It just happens to be sandwiched, sandwiching a 2.5-inch extraordinarily high performance insulation wall.
It did need to be updated slightly in order to hold offices and conference rooms. The old dining room and lounge became a flexible space for informal gathering and events. But beyond the programmatic reinterpretation, certain technical updates did need to be accommodated.
So this building required a contemporary architect to adapt the structure to meet the needs of today's construction standards and to redraw every detail to communicate the intentions of the original architectural design to a contractor. The contemporary architecture firm that did this work was called Thomas Phiffer and Partners. a fantastic practice that's based out of New York. Their work could be considered to carry on the legacy of Mies's design principles, even when they're not explicitly trying to replicate one of his buildings. For instance, Thomas Phiffer, the principal of the firm, even recreated the table of this iconic photograph of Mies for his own house. Even so, Mies never saw this building while it was being constructed. It was built with a modern construction set drawn by another architect, not from the 20-page hand-drawn blueprints by Mies in his office. It also has a modern fire exit and air conditioning, elements that just aren't present in the original.
A Mies stair would have been right at this height and would have been fine. Modern code doesn't allow that. So there's some level of interpretation that our design team had to put into this.
But on the other hand, it does have steel window mullions that help to hold up the floor from the roof.
The wide flange steel columns, these are the classic support columns of the Mies building, certainly provide support. But what most people don't realize is that this mullion actually is holding the floor up. It is a part of the structural system, so it's being hung from the ceiling. So it's holding the floor. So we couldn't install the windows, and we couldn't pour this floor until all the mullions were in.
That's called an umbrella diagram, because everything hangs from the top. You can find this kind of thing at the Farnsworth House or Crown Hall, some of the masterpieces that Mies was able to build during his lifetime.
Those are also features you probably won't find in any other buildings built today. It just doesn't make sense with how we build buildings in the 21st century. Every contractor would much prefer to build the first floor first so that the workers can stand on it in order to build things above it. That umbrella diagram and backwards construction order made this building particularly difficult to make using contemporary contractors.
Probably the most fascinating thing about the building for some is how we've figured out how to heat and cool the building, where you only have a floor and a ceiling that's approximately 15 inches in a gross dimension. Subtract the terrazzo floor, subtract insulation, subtract any of the other surface materials, and you only have about 11 to 10.5 inches to push all of the mechanicals. There are 900 penetrations in the steel floor of this building that all had to be pre-designed and pre-cut prior to the steel arriving on the site, so that all of those mechanicals could be threaded through the steel structure.
This building was also reviewed and declared authentic by Mies van der Rohe's heirs and the keepers of his estate, copyright and likeness. Dirk Lohan, Mies van der Rohe's grandson, who you might see the family resemblance, he worked in Mies's office and still practices architecture today. Upon bestowing his approval for the university to carry on, he declared, "This would indeed be a wonderful assertion of Mies's significance as an architect. I am convinced that Mies van der Rohe, who died over 50 years ago, would have been pleased to see his iconic edifice ultimately being born."
But does all that make this a Mies building? Does it or should it even matter who designed it if it's a good building in its own right?
Authorship in architecture is pretty unique when compared to other art forms. To whom is a building solely attributable? Buildings pass through lots of hands during conception and construction. To say it's the result of one person's vision is pretty simplistic, even when a building doesn't have the unique history that this one has. In one way, architecture is like the composition of music, where a piece is conceived by the artist or the composer, converted into a series of notations to communicate their intentions, and then it is performed by someone else that interprets the work. For instance, Mozart doesn't perform his pieces in the same way that architects don't usually build their buildings. A building's design is interpreted by a contractor who coordinates its construction. So once the design part is done, theoretically, a building could be built at any time, anywhere. It could even be copied at another site, and it could still technically be authentic to the architect's intentions. But the interpretation of the performance of a song or the construction of a building, it adds a lot of nuance to that finished product. There are a lot of construction details that just don't make it into a construction set. If the architect is around, a contractor can just ask for clarification or permission to solve the issue on their own.
Trying to be as faithful as possible to an original author's intentions brings a host of challenges when that author is no longer around to clarify any questions that come up. And of course, there's going to be questions that come up.
We made the choice to go back to a more classic Farnsworth house-like window system, knowing that that had been built, as opposed to some of the detailing that we saw in the 54 blueprints that seemed a bit new We're talking more around aluminum. So these are all steel bar stock windows that would be very consistent with Farnsworth's detailing.
For most of history, music would be played and then disappear. Sound recordings didn't exist before the 19th century, so there's no real way to know how, say, a Bach piece would have sounded originally. But with architecture, physical examples of an architect's work do exist. So with music, the original intention of the composer isn't usually so well defined. The fact that there is a lasting artifact as a result of the architect's creative act makes it a little bit more like fine art, such as painting or sculpture. A chain of ownership or provenance usually proves that an artist made the piece, and there's no question that it looks exactly like the artist intended because they made it themselves.
However, with those practices, the artist usually makes their piece directly. They touch it, they work with the material, and leave a real physical imprint on the work itself.
And we probably all know the importance of provenance in the art world, where authorship matters almost more than the quality of the painting itself. The documentary The Lost Leonardo documents how a painting that was purchased at an estate sale goes on to become the most expensive painting ever sold after being authenticated as a genuine lost Leonardo da Vinci.
But originality and authentic authorship in architecture isn't usually quite so as extreme. Perhaps partially that we don't expect the architect to physically make the product of their creative act.
Interestingly, 50 years before Leonardo da Vinci was painting, there was an artist who was also an architect, Leon Battista Alberti, who attempted to devise a system for replicating paintings, drawings, and architecture perfectly without the author being present. He wanted to find a completely lossless method of reproduction for almost everything that he produced. Beauty and authorship to him was achieved with complete control and untainted reproduction.
But that brings us back to this Eskenazi School of Architecture building. Is this a faithful and untainted reproduction of Mies van der Rohe's vision?
Mies van der Rohe died on August 17, 1969, at the age of 83 from esophageal cancer caused by his love of cigars. He worked right up to his death, and a few buildings like One IBM Plaza here in Chicago finished construction after his passing. Mies never saw that building's completion either. And to be transparent, I think that the Eskenazi School of Art and Architecture building is a remarkable structure. It has a significant presence in its siting, the interior is well laid out, and the materials are exquisitely detailed. I also find that the logistics associated with building a 1950s structure in 2022, I find it fascinating. That we rely on these high-tech ways to solve certain problems in order to maintain the original vision. It took dozens, if not hundreds, of people to make this building possible, and I think the real story is there.
Architects leave traces on the world that often outlive their own bodily occupation of it. Whether their work was built during the architect's lifetime or after, there is an interesting relationship to the world which is ultimately built from the architect's drawings. Authentic authorship is difficult to determine, and this is why it might be time to dismantle our image of a lone genius as a creator of buildings. It's a team effort, and buildings can be appreciated in their own right for their inherent qualities and their beautiful spaces. If you enjoyed this video, please consider giving it a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. You'll be rewarded with content asking important questions about our built environment, which come out on Thursdays. In the meantime, check out some of these other videos. See you over there.